Добрый вечер, дорогие слушатели, дорогие участники встреч «Вне границ». Меня зовут Шихер Анна, я заместитель руководителя факультета психологии в Высшей школе среды обучения. Я рада вас приветствовать на уже еженедельных встречах «Вне границ», которые проводит факультет психологии. И сегодняшнее занятие будет посвящено теме эмоций. Сегодня с нами на связи Англия и Ева Крумхумпер, доктор психологических наук, сотрудник кафедры экспериментальной психологии Университетского колледжа Лондона, который является членом редактуры многих научных журналов, в том числе журнала «Мышление и эмоции», редактором журнала о невербальном поведении, о границах психологии личности и социальной психологии, эксперт в сфере распознавания мимики и эмоций. И сегодня занятие будет посвящено как раз тому, как связаны эмоции и мимика, как мы можем это считывать, можем ли мы это распознавать, насколько эффективно люди в принципе могут это распознавать. Поэтому по нашей с вами организации стабильно 1:15 идет лекция, в конце сессия вопросов. На протяжении всего мероприятия вы можете писать свои вопросы в чате. Я обязательно все их сохраню. На протяжении всего занятия я буду с вами находиться на площадке. И в конце все вопросы будут переведены Еве. Постарайтесь, пожалуйста, писать вопросы на русском, потому что для комфорта синхронного перевода это будет более оптимально. Кроме этого, также для вас подготовлен небольшой интерактив на протяжении занятия, для того, чтобы у вас в том числе тоже была возможность посмотреть, насколько эффективно, возможно, у вас есть возможность считывать эмоции, распознавать их. Поэтому следите внимательно за чатом и прекрасной лекции. Я передаю слово Еве и остаюсь с вами на связи в чате.
Thank you, Anna. So welcome everybody. My name is Eva Krumhuber, and it's really my honor and my pleasure to talk to you with you today and to run through very briefly through the topic and domain of emotions and facial expressions. So as Anna has already alluded to, my work focuses in general on facial expressions and their role in emotion perception and interpretation. So I ask very basic questions like, what do facial expressions express? How do people derive meaning from facial expressions? And what makes an emotion recognizable? And this will be the topic of today's lecture. So let me share my screen to start the presentation. I've divided today's lecture into three very broad themes. There's a lot to say in each, but I would like to give you a brief introduction into each. So the first, we will actually explore several theories that explain what facial expressions mean, what do facial expressions express. Second, we will look into different ways of measuring facial expressions, and I will give you a brief introduction into the facial action coding system, which is one of the most widely used behavioral scoring system for measuring facial behavior. And then lastly, we will look at the meaning of facial expressions and whether we can actually derive emotional meaning from facial expressions and what potential opportunities and challenges arise as part of this meaning aspect. Before we start, I actually have an interactive task for you. This is our first group activity where you can test your emotion recognition abilities, of course, in a very compact manner, because we don't have time to run a 20-minute test, but I've just put together a few videos for you to watch. And I would ask you pretty much now to go to the Mentimeter. You see here the link, and I was told that the link would also be copied in the chat room, that you now go to the voting link, and I will show you now 6 videos of facial expressions, and I will always ask you to guess which emotion you can see in the video. So you will see on Mentimeter always 6 options, 6 labels for 6 basic emotions. And we will then run through those after we've done the emotion recognition test. So I'm still waiting a little bit. Maybe someone gives me a hands up just to give you a bit of time to locate yourself and to go up to Mentimeter. Maybe I go back. You can also, if you open a camera on your phone, you can pretty much scan the QR code and this links you. So I'm just trying it myself at the moment. This should link you directly to the page. And I'll start now with the first video. And please note that all these videos are silent because it's more difficult to recognize the emotion. And I would ask you pretty much to pick one out of the 6 emotions where you think it's most likely the person is feeling that specific emotion. So here you go, here's the first video. I will always show them several times for you to give you time. So they're all very short videos, very short brief video clips. This is the first video. So maybe if you want to indicate, I do the task with you at the same time. Now we go to the second video. Again, this is very brief. I'll show it several times. And I can tell you afterwards a bit more information about in what context, in what situations these facial expressions had been recorded. So maybe if you want to select again one of the 6 emotions. Then we go to video 3. Video 4. Video 5. And the last one. Okay, now let's have a look of how well you did. So I'm sharing my Mentimeter screen. So in video 1, the majority of people said surprise. We have pretty much equal groups, camps here. Some people also saying it's fear, and the correct emotion was fear. fear and surprise are very often confused because they're very similar in their facial expressivity. So they all have often raised eyebrows. They have sometimes even raised eyelids. But in this case, in this context, it was fear, and it was actually an actor that had been asked to portray fear in a very convincing, emotional way. And he was talking at the same time using method acting techniques. The second video, we have quite split responses between anger, disgust, and surprise, and the correct emotion was anger. So the person was not doing a lot, he was just frowning a little bit. But this often can be already a strong sign that something is not right, or that the person doesn't like what he or she sees. So it was anger in that case. Well done. The third video was convincingly, and the majority said sadness, and that's correct. So I think it was very nicely portrayed by this elderly man who was talking in Spanish and was talking about something very sad that happened to him. Video 4, the majority of people said happiness, and that's correct. So it was, the person was very amused, the person was smiling, he was watching an amusing video clip on this computer screen while showing his expression. Video 5, there was a very large majority suggesting surprise, and that's correct. So well done. And last video was disgust. So the person was again showing very clear signs of nose wrinkling and upper lip raising. So these videos come from a variety of batteries, a variety of databases, and they have used various types of various ways of eliciting the emotions. So some of them asked the employed actors to show their facial expression. Some of them had spontaneously filmed participants when they were watching something on the screen. And this is a common strategy in emotion research of how to elicit facial expression. The difficulty now comes in explaining what facial expressions express, and I would like to give you a brief introduction into some of the most prominent emotion theories that exist at the moment. And this is the Darwinian perspective, also often called the basic emotion theory or discrete emotion theory, behavioral ecology view, the cognitive perspective, and the dimensional perspective. And again, it's pretty much a description in a nutshell. There's a lot to say. There would be a lot to say for each of them. But the Darwinian approach pretty much argues, Charles Darwin argued that facial actions actually originally served a purpose other than communication. So Darwin actually didn't argue that a disgust expression expresses feelings of disgust, but he said that it is a revulsion response to potential contamination. So it pretty much just functions, this expression of the tongue sticking out, of raising the upper eyelid. It has to function to spit out food to help protect the organism from ingesting potential contamination, harmful substances or substances that could contaminate the body. And the same with surprise. When we raise our eyebrows, when we raise our eyelids, it's pretty much to increase the visual field, to allow more senses into the eyes, but not because we are feeling surprised. And he argued that these facial expressions, they became communicative by this association. So whenever people felt whenever people ate something that was potentially harmful, they showed this kind of disgust expression, and that became associated over time. And also the meaning of this facial expression became associative or became communicative to other people over time by always showing this association between certain facial actions and certain bodily responses. Ekman, and you can see here actually the line of researchers that were inspired by Darwin. So Sylvan Tompkins was taking up the Darwinian approach, and his PhD students were Carol Izard and Paul Ekman. And Paul Ekman took this forward and actually developed the basic emotion theory, where he argued that there exists an innate link between emotions and expressive behavior. So he argued that facial expressions are directly related to emotions, and they're reflective of our subjective emotions, of our subjective feelings. And he argued that there's a limited number of those basic emotions that you have seen, the 6 basic emotions, and these are primary, or what he called fundamental. So they form the core emotional family. They have an adaptive value. On all other emotional expressions, they are just partial expressions, or they are just part of this family, but the 6 basic emotions, they form the core repertoire. And each emotion is thought to be associated with a distinct facial expression, with a facial pattern, and that facial pattern is prototypical. That suggests it always occurs in a specific configuration. It's innate. It even occurs already in newborns. So there's a genetic component involved in it, and it's universal, meaning that people in different cultures across very different countries express these emotions in the same way. And Paul Ekman did very early studies in the 70s and 80s, where he traveled to very remote cultures and showing that people from New Guinea showed the same facial expressions when they experienced certain emotional events. So he provided a lot of supportive evidence for these 6 basic emotions, but also his methodological approach was also criticized. So that's maybe important to keep in mind. There have been a lot of criticism about how those studies were conducted. Also, most of the time, people were just given the 6 basic emotional labels, as I've done to you previously in the task. But of course, in real life, right, we don't recognize emotions by labels, but we have this kind of this more blended, sometimes this mixed compound perceptions of emotions, and we don't categorize always facial expressions in that way. But his basic emotion theory is one of the most influential theories even nowadays. Even in very recent approaches going into automated facial expression recognition. So his theory is still very, very influential. You can see here a few databases. Actually, most of the databases that exist in the literature focus on the basic 6 emotions. And you can see here that they are more or less extreme. I find them actually quite funny, particularly the Ekman and Friesen pictures from the 80s. They already a little bit of classic, but you can also see that often facial expressions have been very strongly exaggerated. For example, for the NIM-STIM set, you can see really, really extreme facial expressions. And it's questionable to what extent we actually really show facial expressions in real life in this intensity. But that's what exists. Most of the facial expression sets nowadays consist of posed facial expressions, often posed by actors that had been invited to the lab, or that often had been instructed to innovate or volunteer produce certain facial configurations. So actually, most of the time, the people you can see here on the images didn't actually feel the emotion. They were just asked or instructed to portray the emotion in as clearly as possible. And there were a lot of studies showing cross-cultural universality in the recognition of these facial expressions because they are so strong and because they are so prototypical. And maybe one important thing is to also explain, so how did Paul Ekman explain the the expression of this prototypical facial expression. And he had a theory that he called neurocultural theory, and he suggested that there are certain elicitors out there. These elicitors in the environment can be actual elicitors, like seeing a spider, or can be an anticipated situation, looking forward to something, but it can also be recollections of maybe memorizing an event where you felt very joyful or where you felt fearful. So you have this elicitor, and these elicitors, they trigger a neural program that produces the subjective emotion, the subjective experience of the emotion, including physiological and expressive changes. And he called this neural program the facial affect program, which he argued that this facial affect program is pan-cultural. So it's shown across people in different cultures. And this facial affect programs links a distinct set of emotions, the basic 6 emotions, to certain neural impulses. And in earlier writings of Ekman, you can see Ekman's predictions of how the autonomous nervous system changes as a function of the 6 basic emotions. So keep in mind, in the 70s, the autonomous nervous system was state of the art. Nowadays, we do deep brain stimulation and very sophisticated neural network analysis of brain data, so it's all a bit outdated. But he pretty much argued that there's an elicitor, it triggers automatically this facial affect program, and all the neural and facial patterns arise from that. So you have this very raw facial expressions that is pretty much triggered involuntarily, but on top of that, you then have certain rules, he called these display rules, that might modify that raw facial expression. And that display rules are rules that are learned through culture, through society, in whatever ways. And these display rules teach us, for example, to exaggerate an expression. So imagine a scenario where you receive a gift that you actually don't really like, but then you would maybe be showing a stronger smile expression than you would actually show in the first instance, in the first place. Or you might be minimizing the original facial movement by trying to make it appear less intense or brief. Maybe you want to mask it or counteract it. Maybe you feel angry, but you don't want to show this anger, and you mask it with a smile expression. So he argued that these display rules may modulate this raw, unmodified expression, and then this results into the final facial expression. So the problem with this theory is, to me, it's at least the problem is that this idea of display rules, as you can see, it comes afterwards. So it's actually a post hoc explanation, because whenever a facial expression doesn't occur as it was supposed to be predicted based on basic emotion theory, you could always argue, oh, the person probably was under the influence of display rules, and that's why they didn't show the original facial expression. So it's just difficult to predict a facial expression because the display rule concept can always be used as a post hoc explanation to argue why the facial expressions didn't occur as predicted. So it's actually not a coherent theory to me. A very different theory was proposed by Alan Fridlund, who was actually a postdoctoral researcher in Paul Ekman's lab. And he completely went against Ekman's approach, which seems funny, right? If you're a postdoc and you pretty much contradict what your boss is saying. But he pretty much suggested that we misunderstood Darwin, and that facial behavior doesn't express emotions. Instead, it expresses the motive. So happy faces don't express happiness or amusement, but they express the motive to be loving, to reassuring, to be kind to other people. So facial expressions are social tools. They are shown for the social environment. Similarly, sad faces display the need to comfort, the need to receive attention from other people. Angry faces display the motive to aggress, to show another person, wait, I'm about to attack you. And this is a warning sign that if you go one step further, I will jump at you. So why this emphasis on social motives? According to behavioral ecology view, he argued something very similar as Darwin, namely that the display that the facial expression and the sensitivity to the facial expressions, they evolved over time, and they became associated in the course of social interaction. But he argued that facial expressions don't express an underlying subjective experience, but they more or less express a motive, an intention, a behavioral intention to other people. And that's how they should be understood. So for Alan Fridlund, this display rule concept was a two-factor theory where you have first an emotion and then you have a display rule, which either results in felt or false expressions. But to Fridlund, there's actually not a distinction between social and non-social, because social conventions even are part of our initial expression. If we are all sitting in front of our screens now, you might be showing certain facial expressions to my presentation, but just knowing that many other people are watching at the same time might influence a facial expression. So social motives are always part of our initial facial expression. And he did a lot of studies to show this, that, for example, when people are watching even a funny movie at home alone in a room, they would be showing stronger smile expressions when they know that their friends are watching the same movie at the same time in another room. So for Fridlund, social motives are not a post hoc thing, but they are part of the private context. And so the receiver is always part, and we are not living in isolation. We are living, other people are part of our social community. And this community is not only, doesn't need to be physically present. Of course, it's always present in our minds. So the other person is actually always present in people's minds. And he did very interesting field studies. Here's just a classic study from the 80s, where he measured, he recorded people's facial expressions during bowling, and he found that when people are scoring a strike, which is a great experience, which is a successful experience, he actually found that people are not smiling when they are scoring a goal, but they're only smiling at the moment when they turn around to their friends and then indicate or communicate that they have scored a goal. So to him, it's not the experience of subjective joy, of feelings of joy of scoring a goal, but it's this, again, this communicative motive of communicating to your friends that you've scored a goal. And he did also very similar studies with Olympic players, Olympic winners. So they're actually not smiling at the moment when they hear about the successful news that they have won, but they are often smiling when they're standing on a podium or waving to the audience or something. And just today, it was funny to watch the Germans who scored a goal today for the first time. The person was not smiling at all. She was more like in a crash, like, yeah, like she was really like in a crash. And this is not what you would predict when someone wins or something, right? So it's again a very nice demonstration that often smiling occurs as a function of the social context rather than the subjective experience of the emotion. A very different approach is the cognitive perspective. So I'm really jumping very quickly from theory to theory to give you an overview. And the cognitive perspective is, again, very, very different to all the others. Because here, the most prominent follower is Klaus Scherer, and he argues that emotions are pretty much response patterns that result from how we appraise, how we cognitively evaluate the environment. And he calls this appraisal. So the way how we cognitively see, how we cognitively appraise certain stimuli. And he argued that there are no hardwired basic emotions, rather they are modal emotions, that they're emotions that occur more or less often. And this is due to common physical and social contingencies in humans. So of course we experience certain subjective feeling states more often than others. but he wouldn't argue for a basic prototypical facial configuration that always occurs in this distinct pattern, as Paul Ekman had argued. And he said that these appraisals, they have a process character, and through this process character, they allow for a very flexible and adaptive regulation in how people interpret a certain event, because with elicitors, some people smile. In some cultures, people are frowning and showing sadness at funerals. But in some other countries, people are smiling and expressing joy at funerals. Even you could have the same emotion elicitor, but you could have different people in the same community or the same culture showing very different facial expressions, because they evaluate the cognitively appraised event differently. So Klaus Scherer argued that depending on how you appraise the elicitor, you would show different facial expressions. And as such, the same elicitor could elicit very different facial expressions in two different people if they appraise the environment differently. And this, of course, also has consequences for the behavioral reactions that people show. If you see a spider and you hate spiders, you might show a fear expression. But if you love spiders and animals, or if you find spiders fascinating, you may not show a fear expression. You might be showing an expression of elevation or any kind of excitement in response to certain types of spiders. And that makes the cognitive perspective very flexible compared to basic emotion theory, which always predicts a very specific, defined, prototypical configuration in response to an emotion eliciting stimulus. And Klaus Scherer argued that there are certain appraisals, and he was quite specific about those. So you would have an event, maybe just focus on the upper at the upper level, at the top of the figure here. So you have an event, then you have the relevance appraisal, you have the implication appraisal, the coping appraisal, the normative significance. So you see an event, and the first thing that he argued is you are checking out how relevant is this event for me. So here, relevance appraisal is about attention, about do I need to pay attention to this? Because if the event is not important enough for you, you wouldn't even look at it. You wouldn't even pay attention to it. And of course, the most attention-grabbing characteristic is novelty. If an event is novel to you, you're much more likely to look at it, to pay attention, than if an event is familiar to you. The second, so once you have detected, oh, this is a novel event, you go through the implication appraisal. So what are the implications or the consequences of this event for you? And you appraise, you appraise what's the probability that this, that the spider might be biting me, or what's the probability, is this discrepant from my expectations of what I would have expected out of it? How conducive is this with my own appraisals, and is this implication urgent or not? So does it obstruct my goals? My goals maybe would be to stay healthy and safe, or is it actually something that's potentially harmful? Is it relevant for me? Once you have detected that, you have the coping appraisal, where you pretty much check out for yourself, can I actually cope with that situation, with those consequences? Can I adjust to those consequences? Depending on your appraisal, if you can't cope, you might be running away, or you might be attacking, compared to if you think that you can cope with that situation, with that elicitor, you might show a very different facial expression response to it. And finally, you have this normative significance, which is more abstract. It relates more to internal and external standards of compatibility. But you see here a lot of errors, but the important thing is that depending on the appraisals, you show different facial expressions, and these appraisals not only influence the motor expression, but also the subjective feeling state, the physiology, and the behavioral intentions and action tendencies. And of course, this all feedbacks and loops back in various ways. And here you just see an example for each appraisal. So for each appraisal, an emotional response is expressed in the face. You have here, for example, an event that is novel and important. So you show maybe like you're surprised by it. Then you check the implication. Will this event obstruct my goals? If it does, probably you're frowning. If not, probably you're not frowning. Second, then you have the coping appraisal. Like, I can deal with this, or I can't deal with it. If you can't deal with it, maybe you show the kind of crouching in the mouth area where you have some chin raise or some lip pressing where I think I can't get it done, or I don't know what to do. And last, you have this normative significance where you have more related appraisals to it in terms of, is this illicit unfair, or is it immoral? So you might, if it's immoral, you might show some disgust related expressions. So the idea is that over time you have these cognitive appraisals and these facial responses in response to the appraisal, they combine in a dynamic fashion over time, resulting in this final composite emotion expressions that you can see at the bottom through this cumulative effect. I think it's a nice idea of how cognitive appraisals relate to facial expressions. But again, you might be wondering, do we always all the time show facial expressions like this? You know, like we have a lot of cognitive things going on in our head, and is every cognitive appraisals reflected in our facial responses? I think it's easier to measure, to comprehend from a cognitive perspective, but whether these cognitive appraisals are always reflected in the face all the time is probably questionable. But I just show you one of his more recent ideas that he published, where he tried really to link specific appraisals to specific facial actions. And I will go into these facial actions later, but you can see here that, for example, that he suggests the same facial actions like action 4 and 7, frowning, for different appraisals. So he has frowning both in the expectation appraisal, but also in the novelty appraisal. So again, there's no distinct one-to-one relationship between appraisals and facial actions. But again, it's a very different theory, and I think it's nice in the sense that it allows much bigger flexibility to explain people's facial expressions. And it's actually a good way, whenever you see people frowning, whatever, I often see people frowning on the tube or something on the bus, you can always be sure that there's something that's obstructing their goals, or something that's not something that they like, or that's something that goes against their motives. And last but not least, I've also put up here the dimensional perspective, which is again very different from all the other perspectives, and which suggests that emotions can be classified along global dimensions of activation, deactivation. You can also call this arousal, and pleasantness, unpleasantness. This is like valence, positive, negative. And so Jim Russell's the most prominent proponent of this view, and he argued that each emotion occupies a unique region in this multidimensional space, and you might have just mixtures or blends of facial expressions, of emotional expressions that look like this. Again, to me, it's not a model, it's actually not a theory of emotion, and of course it often fails to differentiate between discrete emotions. So it just suggests that there are these two dimensions, valence and arousal, and then people might show varying degrees of these two dimensions in their faces. But of course it's difficult to make predictions in science based on dimensional views. So I leave now up the question for you to ask a few specific questions before we move to the measurement of facial expressions. So maybe if you want to put some questions into the chat, and then Anna or somebody else wants to read them out to me regarding the first part of this lecture.
Пока вопросов нет. Я думаю, что людям нужно некоторое время для того, чтобы их сформулировать, поэтому, наверное, можно пойти сразу дальше.
Yeah, sure. So keep your questions or write down maybe any questions that you have for the second part. So the second part is about measuring facial expressions. And you can see here the face is a very rich and complex system. We have nearly about 40 different facial muscles in the face. And of course, as a facial expression researcher, you want to be specific in saying this facial action is activated or this facial muscle is activated when the person is experiencing this or that subjective feeling. And in order to make these predictions, you need a kind of system that allows to measure these different facial activations in the face in an objective way and in a non-inferential way. So it should not be a subjective way of just looking at the face and say, oh, the person is frowning, but maybe the person is not frowning, but doing something else. And here, Paul Ekman actually made one of the most influential contributions by developing the facial action coding system. Again, this is something from the 70s, but it's still very relevant today. And it's the most comprehensive system that's based on anatomy. So he studied a lot the facial anatomy of which facial muscles occurs and which facial muscle is activated when people do certain facial behaviors. And it's a very big manual. It has about 300 pages in it, but he tries to distinguish all facial movements in the face that can be visually distinguished. And I will explain more about this. Importantly, so he doesn't correspond to a muscle unit, but his emphasis was on the visual description, so not on the electromyographic measurement of the muscle activation, but just by looking at the face, is there an objective way of saying exactly what facial muscle is activated. And he called this action units. So facial behaviors are scored in action units, which indicate which muscles have contracted. And he defined 44 different action units in the upper and lower face. He also defined eye movements, looking up, left, right, eye roll, blinking. He also defined head movements, head rotation, head tilts, head forward, backwards, and so on. So I think in total it's about 60 different action units, but for 44 facial action units. Important it is, so sometimes, so he defined sometimes action units for one muscle. So you can have the orbicularis oris muscle, which is the muscle around the mouth. It's a round muscle that runs around your lips. But he defined different facial actions involving the same facial muscle. So one and the same facial muscle can actually produce or can be involved in different facial actions. So you can have action 22, which is the lip funneler, like this. Or you can have the 23, which is the lip tightener, or the lip pressing. So these are very different facial actions, but they all involve the same facial action, the same facial muscle. On the other hand, two appearance changes that cannot be reliably distinguished, they were combined. So for example, you can have action unit 4, which is frowning, but actually it involves not only one facial muscle, but two. So it involves the corrugator supercilii and the depressor supercilii. And that's very nice for the facial action, that these facial actions, they are meaningful in visual ways. So frowning, we all know what frowning means, but of course, defining facial actions just by muscles alone would have created a more confusing system. And the facial action coding system is really, really influential nowadays. And I'll show you now two. So first, I show you an overview. So these are the different facial action numbers you can see here, and the names that he gave them. And I'll show you now two descriptions to give an insight into this facial action system. You can actually learn this FACS system yourself. It takes about 100 hours to learn. You can learn it from home. I did it at home. I learned it from home. And you can test it. You can take the test online. There are also training courses. So if you're interested in learning it in a group or In other ways, also Erica Rosenberg, she's organizing FACS workshops in the United States. She might be even organizing now online FACS workshops due to the pandemic, I don't know. But if you're interested in learning FACS, you can do it yourself at home. And you just pay for the manual and for the final test. You can do the test several times. If you fail the first time, I failed the first time because I didn't properly code the head movements, and there were a lot of head movements there. So you can take the test 2 times if you want. Just if anybody's interested to learn the FACS coding system. But it is so you would study in your own time exactly how each action unit looks like and what facial changes it produces. Let's take the example of action unit 4. He calls this brow lowerer. This is pretty much the frowning facial action. So you're like putting down your eyebrows, and he has various ways of describing it. So you lower the eyebrows, you push, but also you push the eye cover fold downwards, right? You push down this eye fold downward, you pull the eyebrows also closer together, and it might produce, like in my face, you can see vertical wrinkles between the eyebrows. So he goes into very big, great detail of describing all the visible changes, because it's important to learn all these visible changes, because there might be people who doing something similar, or they are using different facial muscles to produce a similar movements. And then you need to be really clear, and you need to be really clear for yourself of whether this is actually 4 or something else. And you would then also see, you can watch videos where Ekman himself performed the facial action. I also put here a more recent video of an actor where you can see the facial action being performed. And if you want, you can also try it now on the screen, doing it yourself. The most important thing, I actually always notice it's not so difficult to do a facial action, but actually not to move any other parts in your face. So typically, people are doing several things at the same time, but actually the crucial thing is just to do one facial action at one time. So just lowering your eyebrows. Another facial action is action 10. You can try it yourself again. So here you raise the upper lip, and again he describes quite in detailed manner of what the shape of the upper lip should look like, namely this downward curve, like where you raise your upper lip. And you can see also it pushes this infraorbital triangle up, and it deepens the nasolabial furrows. Often he has, of course, more appearance changes. I always put here 4 appearance changes. Sometimes you have 10 appearance changes. It's important to study really all these different appearance changes. And again, you can see here the facial actions. So you have a very nice nasolabial raise with this nasolabial furrow increasing. And of course, you would also show the teeth as a function of this, but you don't have to. So you can also show it without teeth. So Ekman pretty much, he defined prototypical facial actions, patterns for the basic 6 emotions. And you can see here how the facial actions combine. And these are his predictions. I often use these predictions in my own research to say, okay, what did Ekman say? What should a prototypical surprise expression look like? He also defined major variants. These are facial expressions that are not completely prototypical, but still very similar to the prototype, but often they miss 1 or 2 facial actions from the prototype. But you can see here, he defined happiness through action 12, which is the lip corner pull, plus action 6, which is the cheek raise. So you would show a Duchenne smile, but he also said that you can also show a smile, but just raising your lip corners without pulling the cheek raiser. And I have here now a second group activity now for you to code actually which facial actions occur in this woman's face. I give you 8 facial actions as a potential source of actions. Of course, only a few of them are involved, and I hope that you have already received the scoring sheet. So I have prepared a FACS scoring exercise sheet for you, which shows these 8 facial actions that can be used to code the person's facial expression. So we have here as a potential action at 1 is the inner brow raiser, so where you just raise the inner eyebrows. Action 2, it's the outer brow raiser. Action 4, the brow lowerer. Action 5, the upper lid raiser, the staring. And some lower facial actions. You can, we have action 10 here, which is again the upper lip raiser, which we just talked about. The smiling, the lip corner puller, the lip corner depressor, where you pull down the lip corners, and the chin raiser, where you raise your chin. So you have these 8 facial actions. Not all of them occur in the woman's face, but what would you say, which facial actions occur? And please, again, indicate your responses through the voting link that you should be able to find in the chat room. And I'll show you now the person's facial expression again. And I stop sharing my screen. Let's have a look what you indicated. So I already see some people, still waiting a little bit more for people to submit the responses. Again, I'm sharing the screen again that you can see her facial expression. So it's a complex expression. It's difficult. I'm challenging you. But you can see it's much more difficult when the facial actions combine, when you compared to when you just see one facial action in isolation. And that's the complexity of the face. After this training, of the FACS training, you are able to identify single facial actions, even if they combine with other facial actions, and they sometimes start looking a bit different compared to when you occur on your own. But that's why it takes 100 hours to train as a FACS coder and to be certified as a FACS coder at the end. So it's quite a bit of work, but if you're interested, you could try over summer. Okay, let me start sharing the Mentimeter results. So we have here action unit 1, which was correct. And one person said actually 2, that was not. So the person didn't show any outer eyebrow raise, but we have action unit 4, that's very good. And you can actually see here action unit 1 and 4 in combination, which is very important because you can see that at the one end, the inner eyebrows go up, but you also go down, and this produces this kind of wrinkled shape of action at 1 and 4. This is a nice way of seeing it. There was no action at 5 involved, so the person didn't stare or something, or didn't raise her eyelid. Also no action at 10 involved, the person didn't raise, but you can see here action at, many people saw action at 12, the smile in it, very, very good, because you can see here a combination of action at 12 and 15. So you would be surprised this actually exists. People can smile, but at the same time pull down the lip corners, and that's what she's doing. So she's producing this kind of squelched smile expression. You can raise your eyelid, raise your lip corners, plus at the same time put them down. And we can see action at 17. So very well done. So the $1 million question now for you is, what is she feeling? Maybe people want to put some answers in the chat. What is she feeling? What would you say? So most of the time we have compound emotion, we have blended emotion, and to give you a kind of bit of background information, probably most people don't recognize this lady. It's Amanda Knox. She was convicted of killing her British roommate, and she was in prison for quite some time. And this facial image was made when she was released and when she could actually prove her innocence, or at least when her conviction was overturned and appealed. And you can see it's this mixture of relief, of extreme stress, of being happy. There's a mixture of feelings going on, and this is typically the expressions, the facial expressions that you see in real life. So most of the time we don't have these nice, clean prototypical facial configurations as proposed by Ekman. But are there any, so based on what you know about FACS, could there be any limitations in terms of what can FACS not detect? Anybody, any ideas, or what could be facial signs that FACS might not be able to pick up? Are there any, do you have any ideas or any suggestion, maybe later for the discussion, that you can write up? So what could be potential criticisms, or what could be potential things in the face that are not picked up by FACS? There are a few, but I don't want to tell them to you now at the moment, but we can discuss those in the Q&A. This brings me now to the next part, to the last part. And that's the meaning. So what do facial expressions actually mean? As you could already see with Amanda Knox, typically in real life, people show spontaneous facial expressions, and these are often mixtures of emotional states where we feel a bit sad, happy, angry, enthusiastic, frustrated, bored, whatever. Also, most of the time, facial expressions are non-prototypical. Often they are weak, often they are ambiguous, often they contain only parts of a prototypical expression, but they don't occur as these clear prototypes. And of course, most of the time, all the time, facial expressions are moving in space and time. I just put this up here because most of the facial expression literature and most of what we know about emotion expression and emotion perception is based on facial expressions using static still images. And I'm just currently writing up a paper for Nature where we again try to show that there's a huge difference in between dynamic and static facial expressions in terms of what they mean and what meaning people derive from them. So, and all of these three aspects make the meaning of facial expressions much more complex than what we have previously been thinking. And also the probability that a facial expression occurs based on the existence, based on the presence of the emotion, is not the same as the probability for the emotion to occur based on the facial expression. So let's take the example where you might be showing an anger facial, you might be frowning. So there might be cases where you're frowning And this frowning is accompanied by anger. So when you're frowning, you're really angry. But there might also be cases when you're frowning, when you're not angry. And this is very important to keep in mind, that not all cases of anger are accompanied by frowning. So people are frowning for various issues because they have problems reading stuff, or they are frustrated, or they are something else. But frowning is not always linked to anger, as proposed by basic emotion theory. On the other hand, you could have example 2, where all instances of anger are accompanied by frowning. So whenever the person is angry, she's frowning, but that of course means that not all frowns are accompanied by anger. So the person is not only frowning when being angry, but the person is also frowning when being sad or disgusted or bored or something. And then example 3 is when all instances of frowning are accompanied by anger, but not all instances of anger are accompanied by a frown. So the person might be frowning when she's angry, but she might also show other facial actions, that other facial actions, not only frowning. So the person might also maybe press their lips or open their mouth or raise their eyebrows, and these may not be always occur. This may not always be frowning. So this non-coherence, this non-one-to-one relationship between facial actions and emotions just makes it very difficult, because real life is very complex. And sometimes we show a facial expression like frowning, we are angry, but in certain cases we show the same facial expressions, but we are not angry. And this is a big issue for domains like lie detection, where people always predict certain facial configurations to occur as a function of whether people are telling the truth or telling the lie. As I've showed you, basic emotion theory makes a distinction between felt and false expression. So an expression can either be felt, it can either be genuine, that is raw, unoriginated facial expression, or it can be false, it can be masked by display rules where the person tries to conceal the original emotion. So this is often taught under the idea of emotional leakage. People leak the original emotions through, and then you get this kind of masked facial expressions, and these masked facial expressions, they can be indicative of lying. And this is, of course, difficult because you still assume a one-to-one relationship between facial actions and emotions. But as we have seen, facial expressions are very complex. But still, lie detection, there are huge programs in the US, particularly, I don't know what's the situation in Russia, where there has been a lot of money poured into lie detection systems like SPOT or FAST, in trying to detect visible signs of lying, of deception, but but those assumptions are often based not really on strong scientific empirical evidence. And in order to show you the complexity and the difficulty of detecting whether someone is lying, I have prepared the last group activity for you. This is a lie detection test, where you just indicate 2 options, whether the person is telling the truth or is lying. And again, you can vote via the link here. So I've prepared 3 videos for you here. And again, I'll try it myself to see it's working. So this time you have sound, so people are telling a story, and that story might either be fabricated, so nonsense, they didn't experience that event, or it might be a truthful encounter narrative of what they've experienced. And I just mute my, mic.
What is an interesting fact about you that would surprise other people?
Interesting fact, I would probably say that, let's see, well, so I'm Palestinian, and I've got a really large family, but I'd say the surprising fact is that I like being, I'm sort of a solitary type person, so sort of doesn't work well with my family structure, but yeah.
So you want to indicate on Mentimeter whether it's truthful or lying. Second video.
What celebrity would you most like to meet? What would you say to them?
I would most like to meet Beyonce because she's also from Houston and she is an incredible dancer.
What is your favorite hobby and what do you like most about that hobby?
Oh, well, it's a guilty pleasure. It's reading poetry. I mean, it's not a very manly thing to do, but just what the poets bring out and the feelings they evoke are just, you know, a welcome change from the bravado and the machismo you see, you know, playing video games and sports arenas. Just getting away, having a peaceful time is just, I don't know how to put it, but serene.
Let me open Mentimeter again. Oh, we have here a very close vote on whether it's truthful or lying. So the majority, one person just more says it's truthful. And the answer is correct. So the person was telling the truth. Again, the majority says it's truthful, and that's correct as well. The last was again quite. So the correct answer is here that it was a lie. The person was lying. And to me, the person was lying because he came, to me, it was quite clear because he gave a too perfect answer of, was very cognitively elaborate of why people love poetry and so on. But again, I've put here a last question up for which cues did you use to make your decision? We have here a mixture of Russian and English, which is interesting. But I can see here some facial features, some gestural features, right? Yes. Mimics, any other? Interesting. So you looked mostly at nonverbal features. Anybody looked at what the person was telling, or did you look at the content of what they said, or you just really just observed the facial nonverbal features, the behavioral, gestural, kinetics? So let's have actually a look at whether these facial cues are good indicators of lying. So I call this subjective cues. So these are cues that people think that they are related to lying behavior, but these of course do not necessarily have to be related to deception. But one of the most strongest cue that people typically mention is gaze aversion. When somebody asks us a question and we look away, this is typically interpreted as a sign that the person is not truthful. And it's always so this idea of liars don't look you straight into the eye. But this is actually a subjective cue. That's not true. People avoid gazes for reasons other than deception. And people can be lying straight into your face. Another cue that people often mention is the idea that when people are lying, they look up and to the right. This is based on the idea of neuro-linguistic programming that has been going around for certain times, that people are trying to think in the right corner of their brain what they should come up with. Again, this is just a subjective cue. And here are a few more cues that people think are related to deception, like that people fidget around or move around or feel more uncomfortable in their own gestures and respond slower, they pause more what they say. But actually all these cues are not related to deception. These are just what people think relates to deception. So a big, actually 3 separate meta-analyses that included 115 studies looked at 158 cues, so 158 cues. And out of these 158 cues, 75% of those cues were unrelated to deception. So only a small percentage, like 30% of those cues were related. And these were distinguished into verbal and non-verbal cues. So verbal cues were that people often gave shorter responses when they were lying, or the stories were just less plausible or logically structured. There were a few non-verbal behaviors that the person on average made the liar made a more negative impression. Although this is a very gross impression, that the appearance was more tense, probably because the person had to come up with a cognitively challenging response answer, and that the pitch was a bit raised. But it's important to mention that the effect sizes for all these cues, they were very small, suggesting that these behaviors were only weakly related to deception. So none of these cues that you can see here was actually a strong predictor of deception across these 115 studies. Excuse me. So the behavioral differences between liars and truth tellers are actually very small. There's no unique verbal or non-verbal cue or marker to deception. This means I cannot take a random photograph or a random video of a person and say with certainty whether the person is lying or telling the truth. And often there's also no relationship between how well people do in a deception detection task and how well they think they do. So often people are very confident in their deception detection skills, excuse me, but actually the actual deception detection rate is still below average. And this is, of course, a problem if you take professionals like police officers who often feel that they have gone through a lot of training, but actually at the end, this training doesn't help them. Often it makes them actually even more stereotyped or prejudiced, but they're actually not more accurate than other people. So there are a lot of studies comparing police officers versus naive observers, and often they're not better than these naive observers. And this is, of course, a problem because with the huge development of AI developments in deception detection research, people just feed in videos of people lying or telling the truth, and then the algorithm will always come up with a response, with an answer. You can see a study that was done by Chinese researchers, published in 2016. Where they submitted 2,000 images from criminals and non-criminals to a machine classifier. The machine classifier then found the structural features for predicting criminality. So the machine said, oh, there's a lip curvature, there's a difference in the eye corner distance, there's a difference in the mouth-nose angle that predicts whether someone is a criminal or a non-criminal. And that is, of course, dangerous by making answers like this, because, as I said, the machine classifiers will always find differences. And even if these differences are tiny, and again, keep in mind that there are lots of confounds, social confounds of these faces. So some like age or social status or social class or hierarchy that might just be unwanted confounds that might influence whether someone is perceived as more or less criminal. So this is a big problem with deception detection. It becomes more and more automated, where people try to let the machine predict whether the person is telling or lying, telling the truth or lying. And as we have seen with COMPAS, which is a widely used algorithm used in the States at predicting crimes, it was actually no more accurate than the average person. So it was pretty much used for risk assessment, and it was pretty much used to predict whether a person, whether a defendant was at risk of recidivism, of whether they would be committing another crime again in the future. And so COMPAS was not only similarly inaccurate or fair than by any other people, but it was even biased against Black defendants. So Black defendants were actually more likely to be marked at risk of committing a crime compared to white people. This is because probably the algorithm had been trained on an unequal sample of videos that came from Black and white people. And of course, it's always the training database, the training set on which an algorithm is trained that predicts of how well it will do. So you would actually need to train on millions and millions of videos and images. But of course, this is most of the time not the case. So people always train on a very limited number of data sets. And this is a huge problem because at the moment you see developments out in industry where companies are very confident in what they say. So for example, this automated interviewing technology, it's called Avatar. It's being used at the US-Mexican border. And it's an algorithm developed by Discern Science, where they argue that all our solutions are straightforward, they're user-friendly, and they're proven reliable by rigorous science. That's not true. But yeah, to make claims like this is actually very ambitious and not based on rigorous science to claim like this. They use a lot of cues. They use linguistic, vocalistic, kinesic, gestures, body posture, facial expressions all together to assess deception. But in the end, it's a black box. Nobody knows how these machines work, or and as I said, they are not based on rigorous science, because science is very ambiguous and very very split in terms of what cues could be used and whether those cues are reliable. Similarly, just to finish off with another lie detector project by the European Union. This is called Eye Border Control. There have been about 5 million euros going into this. It's pretty much like a virtual agent, a virtual policeman that talks to you in order to detect whether you are telling the truth or lie, and it's used at the border control. And again, they made very strong statements that these are effective extractors of information and so on. The use of microfacial gestures and so on. So it's very dangerous to make predictions based on single facial actions, what they mean in terms of emotions and whether they are truthful or not. So I just would like to finish off with this cartoon. Imagine a situation where you're sitting in a test and at the end the person says to you, I'm sorry to say, you have failed your test because you didn't make a sad face when a sad story was being narrated to you, because a sad face would be prototypical to show in response to a sad elicitator. But of course, that's not the case of how facial expressions are shown in real life. So does this then mean that the study of facial expressions is useless? Well, it depends. In basic research, we compare groups, right? We look at group 1, experimental group, and we will look at group 2, control group, and we make averages across a lot of different people to predict certain emotional states or whether the person is deceiving or lying. And we can say on average, people in this group showed more of these cues, or people were more accurate or less accurate in detecting these cues. But of course, in applied research, this issue is much more complicated, because in clinical research, for example, in order to detect whether someone is lying, in order to gain certain benefits of being able to leave the hospital or anything, or in forensic context, you typically always want to make a prediction based on one single case. So whether an individual felt a certain emotion. Here, the data that we currently have is just not suitable to make this kind of prediction. So we don't have this individual-based, event-based data that would allow us to make these predictions, as I said, because most of the research so far just was done based on group differences, on group averages. And that's important to keep in mind for interpreting facial expressions. So you can say probably this person is feeling this or that, but always keep in mind that there are exemptions, and people not always show a prototypical facial expressions, and people may not always feel this specific emotion that has been predicted. On average, it may, but in this specific instance or in that specific individual, that might not be the case. And that's all from me for now. So I'm just looking forward to your questions.
Ева, спасибо большое. Мы начинаем сессию вопросов, и уже несколько вопросов появилось в чате. Подскажите, можно ли сказать, что человек с плохо развитой мимикой менее социально адаптирован?
What do you mean by badly evolved mimics? People who are not able to mimic facial expressions, or people who are just less expressive than other people? This would be important to keep in mind. So is it about the interpreting of the emotion in other people, or is it about your own expressiveness that might have also influence on what other people show? Because if you're less expressive in the first place, people have problems interpreting, or it just hinders the social communicative process. That's the stream of information that runs between us. But if it's about the person having problems in not being able to properly mimic the facial expression, maybe the person just stands there, deadly faced, then this might also have an influence. So there are studies on both ends by showing that when you block, or when people have, for example, Botox treatments, or when people are supposed to show a neutral facial expression and not mimic the other person's facial expressions, that they find it more difficult to interpret the meaning, particularly of subtle or ambiguous facial expressions, when it's not exactly clear of what the person is expressing in the face.
Спасибо за такой развернутый ответ. Появилась ясность в этой теме. Знакомы ли вы с книгой Лизы Барретт про эмоции? И что вы думаете о ее теории конструирования эмоций?
Yeah, I didn't go into this because it's less focused on facial expression. So it's more a kind of social constructivist approach. And I think it's wonderful to examine in terms of emotional subjective feelings about brain responses. But again, it's less... it says less about facial expressions, but the idea is pretty much, again, she goes away from basic emotion theory. She even goes away from cognitive appraisal theories. But the idea that Lisa Feldman Barrett has is that that you need language to communicate in. We have language to label certain things. But her idea is that actually most of the subjective experiences are broader. So she calls this affect, and that makes a difference between affect and emotion. So an emotion might be a construct that we have developed in language, like fear, frustration, boredom, any kind of emotional label. But affect is actually more coarse. Affect could be a kind of a mixture of feelings. Imagining eating an ice cream or eating a bag of crisps, and you come to the end of eating the bag of crisps. How do you feel? you might be feeling a sense of sensation that comes from eating it. You might be feeling sad because you're turning towards the end of the package. You might have this mixture combination of subtle, visceral, cognitive, physiological impressions that she calls affect. And then you have, of course, if somebody would ask you, how do you feel right now? You would have to turn this gross feeling of affect into an emotional word. So you would have to come up with a social constructive process through communication, because that's how we communicate. When somebody asks you, how do you feel? We need to say a word that people know. We can't say just that's raw. We have to say it's anger, or it's I feel frustrated or something. And that's her idea, that actually most of the time that that we need emotions to communicate, we need emotional labels to communicate, but actually the real emotions are the affect, so the raw, coarse, affective feelings that could be anything, that could be feeling hungry. In one situation, you might interpret hunger as sickness, or in the other situation, you might interpret hunger as excitement. Maybe if you're shortly before an exam, you might interpret hunger as sickness. But if you're in preparation for a very nice meal, that you might interpret it as amusement, excitement. And depending on the language, depending on the social constructive process that you use to communicate this raw, coarse feeling, your feeling will be different and the emotional world will be different. And that actually applies to any other process in the world, because we construct everything. I need to say this is a pen. I can't say this is a plastic thing with something black inside. You wouldn't know what it is. We need the word, this is a pen. And we know this by saying the word pen, you know what it means, and I know what it means. So this makes communication possible. And that's the same for emotions, or for any other category like gender, right? We say male and female, but actually there is nothing like male or female, or color. There is no black or red or green color. It's just a continuum. But we construct these labels in order to better communicate with our world, because everybody knows when I say green, you know what green means.
Возможно ли полностью контролировать мимику лица?
Yes, but typically only for a short amount of time. But you can train, or I don't know, you can try to remain neutral. In some meetings, I try to remain neutral. Or sometimes when you're angry, you just bite in the lips or something. I don't know, it depends. People maybe are better or worse than others. There have been studies done on facial motor control. Certain facial movements are easier to control. That's what also Ekman argued, that in his emotional leakage hypothesis, he argues that certain facial movements are better to control than others, and some just leak through. So he argued, for example, with the Duchenne smile, that people can only show a Duchenne smile when they're really happy. So when they have action 6 activation, so this kind of happy smile where you have the cheek raise and the lip corner raise. And he argued that when people are not happy, they would not show this action 6 activation. Also in my own research, I found that people can actually voluntarily activate action 6 by just making a very intense smile, and I have my action 6. But yeah, for certain facial actions, it might be more difficult than others. It depends. There are certainly individual differences and skills and gender differences.
А как научиться выражать свои эмоции и чувства, если человек всю жизнь их скрывал от людей и от себя?
So the question is about, you have an interaction partner and the person is pretty much hiding her emotions. How could this affect you? And how could you, I don't know, you mentioned the term learning. So I assume this is like maybe a relationship between mother and child, because typically we are surrounded by more people in daily life by just one person from which we learn, but typically the children learn facial expressions from interaction partners. And of course, it's a huge problem in clinical settings if mothers are depressed. Typically, depressed mothers show very little facial signs. And this is very difficult for the baby or for the infant to interpret, for example, whether the situation is pleasant or not, or whether the mom likes something or not. It learns through imitation. And if there's no facial expression shown by the mother in the first place, then it's very difficult for the child to predict whether this stimulus is pleasant or not. So learning is all about imitation and predicting certain events in the environment. So I don't know, you probably know this term social referencing, where you look at my face, and if I show like this, you would know through my face that this is very dangerous. So you shouldn't put your hand on the oven because it's dangerous. And just by my facial expression, it would communicate to you, don't do it. It's very dangerous. But if I don't show this facial expression, you wouldn't know, you wouldn't be able to learn. And so learning is very important, particularly for parent-child relationships.
А если мы говорим о взрослом возрасте, как человеку во взрослом возрасте научиться выражать свои эмоции? Может быть, есть какие-то инструменты?
I would say we don't need to learn it, because unless you had a very unusual upbringing, we all learn to express our emotions. So the most important thing is actually to be natural, and the term authentic is nowadays very often used. So be authentic in who you are, and you don't have to exaggerate. If you don't like things, you say I don't like it, and you show the right relative facial expression. It comes across as much more authentic than if you try to pretend, oh, thank you so much for this unwanted gift. Typically, I mean, it comes across through various ways, and if it's not the face that comes across as unauthentic, then it's the voice or the gesture or something that's missing. So the best way is just to be who you are, and it will be the right way, unless you're asking a different question here, which I don't get.
Ева, спасибо большое за такой развернутый ответ. У нас уже заканчивается время. Тема очень действительно интересная, поэтому, чтобы в тайминге находиться, последний вопрос, и будем переходить к завершению. Подскажите, что именно вы имеете в виду под предсказыванием выражений эмоций?
Predicting events in the environment. So we typically show, or caregivers show facial expressions, and that facial expressions have a predictive meaning. So when you see a fearful face, you know that the stimulus I'm looking at is fearful, and you probably better run away from the lion. So here the facial expression has a predictive meaning, because it connotates something. Based on my facial expression, you can predict that probably I'm looking at something scary, and that might be scary to you as well. So faces have an informational value to others. They're communicative. We communicate intentions. That can be something that we do to other people or that happened to us. And that allows you, so when someone shows an anger facial expression, you can predict that the person doesn't like you, might be attacking you, does something harmful to you. So this is a way for you to make sense of the environment, and that's what Friedland argued so much, that facial expressions are all about the communicative aspect, about showing our intentions and motives to other people, that other people can better know, better don't approach this person because the person is really frowning and looking angry, or looking in a way that doesn't look friendly to me. And not so much about what the person is really feeling, or whether the person is feeling frustrated or something, but that facial expressions are more, any signal in the world is pretty much a signal for people to make intentions. And that also applies to AI and virtual agents in the future, that where people try to predict, and that's often difficult with virtual agents. When virtual agents show facial expressions, because they might behave very differently than humans. But this is a very different topic. I can teach on that separately in a different seminar.
Спасибо огромное, было очень интересно. К сожалению, наше время уже подходит к концу. Действительно, спасибо большое. Я думаю, что после
Good luck to
сегодняшней
everybody.
встречи...
All the best. And let me know if you have questions, you can also email me.
Да, спасибо большое. Мы оставили почту. Через нас мы сможем, через Елену в том числе, передать вопросы. Спасибо большое за действительно очень содержательное, интересное мероприятие с интерактивом, потому что тема действительно актуальная и тема очень популярная, и вокруг нее очень много мифов. Поэтому особенно ценно, когда есть понимание того, как с научной точки зрения на самом деле работают эмоции, работает мимика, и где вот эта вот та грань мифов и реальности, той, которую мы можем действительно наблюдать. Поэтому спасибо большое за сегодняшнюю встречу. Спасибо большое всем участникам за ваши вопросы, за то, что принимали участие в интерактивном компоненте сегодняшней встречи. На сегодня мы с вами заканчиваем, но мы с вами встречаемся ровно через неделю, 3 августа, также в 19:00. На следующей неделе мы с вами погрузимся в не менее важную тему. Лекцию проведет Кристина Маслач по теме профессионального выгорания. Человек, который не только является таким одним из мастодонтов профессионального сообщества, но и человек, исследования которого легли в основу того, что профессиональное выгорание будет представлено в международной классификации болезней 11-й версии, поэтому тема очень важная для психологов и с точки зрения работы с людьми, которые, возможно, столкнулись с синдромом профессионального выгорания, и с точки зрения понимания профилактики, но и, конечно же, для собственной психогигиены, потому что психолог – это человек, который подвержен в том числе синдрому профессионального выгорания, поэтому вам всем прекрасного вечера и до встречи через неделю на факультете. Всего доброго, до свидания.